Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I'm Kemper Donovan.
I'm Catherine Brobeck.
And in this episode, we are covering A Murder is Announced. It is time, Catherine.
Kemper.
I just could not be more excited to begin this episode. And Catherine Brobeck, why don't you start us off with a little bit about the publication history?
So it was first published in the UK by Collins Crime, of course, in June 1950. And actually the same month in the US, which we don't actually get that frequently, if you think about it. And I think that the big reason for that is it was touted as her 50th novel.
Right.
It's not really her 50th novel, as anybody paying attention to our episode numbers would realize.
Right. It's actually her 40th novel.
Yeah, because that 50 number was counting compendiums, the short story collections, and also, I believe, different US and UK editions. Yeah,
they had to really jury rig the stats there to get to 50, which apparently they were just really determined to do.
Yeah, and also because I think it was 1950 too.
Yeah, actually, this is what our friend John Curran has to say about the occasion that was marked. It was the occasion of a major launch and celebration party in London's Savoy Hotel in June 1950. She happily posed for photographs with Sir William Collins beside a cake iced with the jacket design. Other guests included fellow crime writer Niall Marsh and the actress Barbara Mullen, then appearing in the West End as Miss Marple in The Murder at the Vicarage. So this was quite a do.
Sounds like it would have been delightful to be at. I'm a little jealous.
Yeah, I think it's worth noting the true 50th novel, by the way, is Ordeal by Innocence. We keep on mentioning that one. I'm just building up the suspense for Ordeal by Innocence.
I don't know if I should be dreading that it's not going to be really great or if we should just be really excited for it.
I know. I think it's going to be one of the standouts among the later titles, so we shall see.
And we should also know it has a lot in common with The Companion, which is a Miss Marple short story that belongs to the 13 Problems, the Tuesday Club Murders collection. And that story itself was originally published in the Storyteller magazine in February 1930, so 20 years previously.
In fact, the two older women in that short story lived in a house called, wait for it, Little Paddocks, even though the story takes place abroad. But yes, The Companion, and there are actually two other short stories that have some similarities as well. Christie was drawing on a lot of tropes that she drew on in earlier works, as she so often does to such wonderful effect. So we will definitely talk about that. Let's move right along to our victim, a Mr. Rudy Shares, who is a foreigner working at a local hotel spa in England. We are very much in England in this story. He is the guest appearance at the titular announced murder. We will get into that in a moment. He has a starring role, only to seemingly accidentally shoot himself in the mayhem while grazing the intended victim. And who is that seeming intended victim, Catherine?
Miss Letitia Blacklock, who is an elderly spinster whose house is the scene of said announced murder, and yeah, her ear is grazed.
Let's move on to our suspects, and we are going to do something different from what we normally do in this category because we usually have a whole bunch of people to list here, and in this case, we really only have one true suspect, who is the dead man.
The man with the gun.
Our victim, yeah, he's the man with the gun. That would be Rudy Shares. He's the only quote-unquote suspect here, and he is dead. So given that this is a 300-page mystery novel, this is one of Christie's longer novels.
Yep.
There's obviously something else going on here. As is so often the case in Christie, pretty much everyone we meet within the novel is a suspect, but it makes more sense just to get into the world as it appears to be, because we're going to meet all these people in situ, as it were. So let's just keep that in mind.
So, world as it appears to be. A newspaper advert appears in the local Chipping Cleghorn paper, and it reads as follows. A murder is announced and will take place on Friday, October 29th at Little Paddocks at 6:30 p.m. Friends, accept this, the only intimation.
By the way, another fun fact, apparently an earlier title for this was A Death Has Been Arranged, because Christie did some fiddling with the wording of that newspaper advertisement. But I think A Murder is Announced has the right ring to it. It's a great title. Little Paddocks itself, within the town of Chipping Cleghorn, is a house that belongs to Letitia Blacklock. And there are a bunch of other people who live there, including her childhood friend, Dora Bunner, who goes by the nickname Bunny, not to be confused with Edmund Wilson, right? So Bunny is a bit of a dingbat, sort of in the Rose Island vein for Golden Girls fans. And then also living at Little Paddocks are Philippa Hames, who is a pretty young widow with a small child, Patrick and Julia Simmons, who are a brother-sister duo, and they are distant cousins of Letitia, even though they're referred to as her niece and nephew. And then the cook/maid, Mitzi. Yeah, we need to talk a little bit about Mitzi. We will be addressing her in our Stuck in Its Time category for sure.
For sure.
There is something anti-Semitic in the portrayal of Mitzi, who is very much billed by herself and others as a refugee of World War II who has survived a concentration camp. In any case, all of these people who are living at Little Paddocks decide that, okay, I guess since a murder has been announced and none of them knows anything about it, they are just as floored by this newspaper advertisement as everyone else in the town. They say, okay, I guess we're probably going to have some visitors coming and this must be a big joke and let's see what happens.
And sure enough, at 6:30, the following people also show up to Little Paddocks. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Harmon, two elderly spinster roommates, Miss Murgatroyd and Miss Hinchcliffe. And let's just say there is some strong implication that they might be more than roommates. Colonel and Mrs. Easterbrook, of course, previously based in India because Christie loves a good former British Army colonel. Edmund Swettenham and his mother, the former of whom is a writer who really just spends a lot of time name-dropping Tennyson.
Right, yeah, I believe he even mentions Maud, which we know at this point was a favorite of Christie's. In any case, they all gather and wait, and at 6:30, the lights go out. And someone comes into the room shouting for them to put their hands up while a flashlight is being shined in everyone's faces. And then there are 3 shots fired and the lights go back on and Miss Blacklock is bleeding from a grazed ear. And there is this unknown masked man just lying there dead. The police are called. He is subsequently identified as our victim, Rudy Shares, employee at the local spa. And death is attributed to an accident or possibly a suicide. No one is satisfied with that. Most of all, the reader. It's just too weird. And Inspector Craddock, who is our lead detective here in this story, just has a bad feeling about all of this. And he puts off the inquest while the police look just a little further into what is going on here. Namely, did someone actually want Letitia Blacklock murdered?
Right. So meanwhile, Sir Henry Clithering, I know, formerly the head of Scotland Yard, dear friend to one Miss Jane Marple. Sir Henry and the local police chat a little bit about this case, and he agrees to go along on this jaunt to the spa to do an interview with Shares' girlfriend, when also the local police get a letter written in a distinct spidery handwriting. It's from none other than Miss Jane Marple. And she happens to be staying with Mrs. Harmon, who is the daughter of an old friend of hers. And she's also taking treatments at the spa for her various old age maladies.
And who's paying for those treatments, Catherine?
One Mr. Raymond West.
That's right. Because you know what? As much as we do like to rag on nephew Raymond, he is a good nephew in a monetary way. She manages to get in a dig about Raymond, quote, priding himself upon never writing about anything pleasant. And then she even criticizes his wife Joan's artwork. She says that Joan's art consists mostly of, quote, jugs of dying flowers and broken combs on windowsills. Burn, Miss Marple. This is a fantastic Miss Marple novel. We're at about page 90 when she comes in of a 300-page novel, so it takes her a bit to get there, but when she's there, she's there. Before Miss Marple even makes her appearance, Sir Henry starts talking about how he wishes Miss Marple were there. I've said this before, his best quality is how much he appreciates the genius of Miss Marple. So before she even makes an appearance, he says, I wish I had my own particular old pussy here. Wouldn't she like to get her nice ladylike teeth into this? Right up her street, it would be. And then, when the letter comes, first he uses one of the best exclamations ever. Ye gods and little fishes, said Sir Henry.
Right.
Can it be? And then Catherine, what does Sir Henry say after that about his Miss Marple?
It's my own particular, one and only, 4-starred pussy the super pussy of all old pussies.
I mean, I'm personally shocked that no one's Twitter bio reads 4-starred pussy, the super pussy of all old pussies, with a little attribution to a murder is announced. Why hasn't that happened? I really hope that this will be rectified very, very soon.
So what the letter actually says is that Miss Marple has some evidence, namely that Rudy Shares was a petty thief who was skimming customer bills.
Of course, Miss Marple cottoned on to that immediately. How dare he? Miss Marple totally agrees with Inspector Craddock that something doesn't add up here. Shares is obviously a petty criminal. He's trying to swindle old ladies and not doing a very good job of it. So he just doesn't seem to be the kind of person who would put this announcement in a newspaper and go to their house and try to murder them in this elaborate way and then kill himself. I mean, maybe he could have accidentally killed himself because he's that doofy, but that just seems weird too. So on Sir Henry's advice, Miss Marple is allowed to read the case file of what happened on the night in question. So she's getting access here, which is what she often so sorely lacks. And the investigation proceeds. And the question really is, why would someone want to kill Letitia Blacklock?
So it turns out that in a somewhat convoluted manner, while she does not currently have much net worth of her own, she was once a secretary / junior partner of an incredibly famous financier named Randall Girdler, or RG, as he gets later referred to in a number of letters. And she quit her job with him, though, some years earlier to go to Switzerland to care for her younger sister, Charlotte, at a sanitarium / clinic there. And both women ended up staying in Switzerland, and then they would later go on to help the Red Cross in the war effort, etc. Meanwhile, RG and his wife, Belle, never had children of their own, and Belle is a lifelong invalid. So his will provided a life income to Belle, and on her presumably early death, if she outlived RG, his fortune would go to his beloved secretary / junior partner, Letitia. And Belle is very near death as it currently stands. She's on morphia and only has occasional lucid moments. So it doesn't serve anyone to kill Letitia first.
Except maybe it does, because it turns out that RG had a sister named Sonia, who had a falling out with him over her decision to marry a vaguely criminal-seeming Greek man. Sonia and RG became estranged, but in later years, at Belle's insistence, Sonia's 2 children, who they only know as Pip and Emma, would actually become the heirs should Belle outlive Letitia. And I had to look this up because when Belle says, oh, well, I only know them as Pip and Emma because that's what Sonia said, probably as a joke that she was going to call them, it's because they were born in the afternoon. Pip and Emma are signifiers of the letters P and M.
Right.
Pip and Emma refers to the afternoon. So she never really knew if those were their actual names or family nicknames or just a throwaway joke in that one letter. So we really have no idea what their names actually are. But the missing Pip and Emma, these 2 children, are the only ones who would, in fact, have a reason to kill Letty, because should she die before Belle, they will inherit RG's entire fortune. So that means that one of the many 20-somethings in Chipping Cleghorn, we just went through a list of them, Julia, Patrick, Philippa Hames, Edmund Swettenham, any of them could be Pip and Emma. And there's a lot of real estate given in this book to trying to figure out who Pip and Emma are.
During all this, Craddock realizes that there's actually an extra door into the drawing room, and this is one of those situations where it actually would have been nice if there'd been a diagram in the book. Like, I could have used
it's kind of true.
Plan.
Fair point. Fair point.
Yeah, because I think there are 5 or 6 doors that are involved in this hallway, parlor, kitchen combination. There's one mystery door which doesn't work because it's actually the door to what was a separate room, and then they took out a dividing wall. So they closed one of the doors when it wasn't 2 rooms, except it has just been recently oiled.
Right. So what it means is that someone could have slipped out of the drawing room through this second door, gone through the hallway, and snuck up behind Rudy Shares. It had not only been opened recently, but even oiled because it opened without a sound. So this is really the moment at which Craddock realizes, oh, wow, the call is coming from inside the house, so to speak. I mean, someone could have walked into the house from elsewhere in the village, but that closed circle of suspects, i.e. everyone who came to the murder announcement at Little Paddocks, at this point, they truly are all suspects.
It takes us a while to get there.
No, it does, because before then, it's just a bit of a conundrum. It's like, what is happening here? How and why is this even a murder? And we still don't even necessarily have a very clear notion of the why, but the how is becoming a little bit more apparent at this point. The police also discover that Rudy's girlfriend knows more than she has been letting on. She also works at that fancy hotel spa, and she knows that Rudy was hired for that job of coming to Little Paddocks and pretending to hold everyone up, but not by whom. Part of the job was to place the ad in the Chipping Cleghorn newspaper and then act out a stick 'em up as some, quote, silly English joke, end quote. At the same time, Bunny, that would be Miss Blacklock's companion, has lunch with Miss Marple at a local cafe and yammers on about Letty and the furnishings at Little Paddocks, including this lamp of a shepherdess, or maybe it's a shepherd in the hall that had been moved, and she's talking about how, well, it was a shepherd at one point and now it's a shepherdess.
Bunny again has that kind of Rosen Island winding story thing. It's not entirely ever clear where it's going, so when she's talking about the shepherdess and the shepherd and Letty, and sometimes she calls her Lottie, and that's also kind of confusing, and she just seems like a little addled. She
just seems generally confused. Moving on, let's talk about Bunny's birthday, Catherine.
Yeah, so they do a death by chocolate cake.
Delicious death.
Yes. Let's just say Mitzi does not have a lot of good feelings about that cake's name, but she makes it anyway. And everybody gets kind of sick off of it because it's too decadent. Bunny decides that she doesn't feel well and that she needs some aspirin, but her aspirin's gone missing. So she takes the one next to Letitia's bed. And guess what happens the next morning?
She dead.
She dead, because that was not aspirin. Unfortunately for the criminal investigation, most of the same suspects were at the birthday party. So they're also a suspect here.
Meanwhile, back at the vicarage, Miss Marple is trying to turn on a lamp when the vicarage cat, who's named Tiglath-Pileser, because of course he is, knocks over a bowl of roses, wetting the lamp's wire. Unfortunately, Tiglath-Pileser previously chewed through the wire, so it's frayed and the lamp fuses out, shutting off all the electrical light in the entire room. Then Miss Marple gets really quiet and thinks for 2 minutes straight, which is never a good sign, for a murderer, that is. At the same time, over at the home of the Mrs. Hinchcliffe and Murgatroyd, Hinch is urging her friend Murgatroyd to exert herself to remember what she might have seen the night of the titular murder announcement. The reason why is that it's been established Miss Murgatroyd was behind the door when Rudy Shares came into the room. That means that she is the only one who didn't have the flashlight shine in her face, and even more importantly, who, because of that, could see what the flashlight was shining on. Because if you're in front of the flashlight, even when the flashlight's not shining on you, you see nothing because it's dark. And then when the flashlight's shining on you, you also see nothing because you're blinded. But Miss Murgatroyd could actually see who the flashlight was shining on as it went from person to person. That means that if she can figure out who was not in the room when Shares burst in and shone his flashlight on all of them, that person must be the murderer. So Miss Murgatroyd dithers for a while and says she can't remember. And then just when she's remembered something, Miss Hinchcliffe, of course, gets a call about a red setter who's been left at the train station, because of course she does. And Miss Hinchcliffe is off. Miss Murgatroyd calls after her, she wasn't there. And from there, we transition into a very unusual scene for a Christie novel. There's a dialogue between Miss Murgatroyd and the unnamed murderer in the book, so that we know it's someone who Miss Murgatroyd knows, but she then overtakes her and strangles her with a scarf. We're obviously never told who that person is, but we do also know at this point that the murderer has to be female, right? Because Miss Murgatroyd said she. But it's a really odd portrayal of a murder in Christie. They're almost always after the fact. Not always. Like, I remember The Hollow, we kind of were there when John Christo was shot. But this one's even more immediate. And because it's violent and it's a strangulation, it's odd for Christie. So just worth noting.
Then Miss Hinchcliffe, read Setter in Tow, meets up with Miss Marple out in the rain and invites her over to tea, at which point they both, of course, discover Miss Murgatroyd's dead body, and poor Miss Hinchcliffe is devastated.
And so then after this, Miss Marple basically disappears, which is a concern to everybody. Not good. And all of the suspects get rounded up into little paddocks for a denouement.
They sure do. And my God, Catherine, what is going on here? This is so confusing. I think we need some clues.
Clue number 1. Take it away, Catherine.
Miss Blacklock has a weird insistence on wearing a pearl choker with her tweeds. Why would you do that? It's not a look. She wears them with every single outfit. Maybe weird clothing choices in Agatha Christie are a sign of something else. Would point back to the capture of Cerberus and the idea that a young woman wearing unusually large clothes was an indication of something else.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, this really is a costuming clue. It's an odd clothing choice, and costumes are used to hide from view. What is she hiding from view here, potentially, with this out-of-place necklace? Let's think on that. Our next clue, Agatha's favorite insistence that all elderly women blend together, which we have seen many a time before, is repeated here multiple times. I mean, we can go back to The Companion, which is predicated just on that alone. I mean, the fact that two elderly women are almost interchangeable. The foundational concept there is the switcheroo. We've talked about the switcheroo before.
Yeah, of course we have.
And Christie is just really fond of switcheroos. I mean, we also saw this in The House at Shiraz in Parker Pine Investigates. We had a switcheroo involving two women there where a companion...
Although young women.
They were younger, yep. A companion was pretending to be her mistress after her mistress had died. And we also had this in The Voice in the Dark in The Mysterious Mr. Quinn, where a woman pretended that her sister was actually her maid. And we even just saw it in Taken at the Flood, right? Where a servant was switched for a supposed widow. So perhaps that's going on here. And I think what's so brilliant actually about that Pip and Emma intrigue.
It's a really brilliant red herring just because it's asking you to look for the very one thing that you should in fact be looking for.
Right. The whole Pip and Emma intrigue is asking the reader to think about who among these characters may be pretending to be someone other than who they say they are.
But it's misdirecting you because you're looking at all the young people and perhaps you should be looking at the old people. We gripe often about red herrings that have nothing to do with anything and seem thrown in there for obfuscation only. And this one is thrown in there for obfuscation, but in that it's misdirecting the reader so cleverly. This is perhaps my favorite red herring.
And then we have this tiny little devious clue, which has to do with the blocking of the whole stick 'em up nonsense on the night of the advertised murder. If, as an astute reader will have realized by now, Rudy Shares was in fact murdered for some reason, well, then a key component of that murder being pulled off successfully was that no one could see a thing except for poor Miss Murgatroyd, of course. And the reason for that is that the electricity had shorted out somehow, but let's not forget, this was written in the late 1940s when people still used their fireplaces regularly, and it is the night of October 29th, a night when a fire may well have been in order, but there was no fire, and we in fact get several references to the fact that Letitia Blacklock, as the owner of Little Paddocks, has insisted on turning on the central heat. Many characters comment on this the night of Rudy Shares' death. The deduction here is that perhaps we'd do well to take a second look at Miss Blacklock, since the lack of a fire, something only she controlled, is such a key element to pulling off this weird and elaborate murder of Rudy Shares. This is one of those Christie clues that seems so obvious when we're on the other side of it, but boy, is it hard to get there on one's own.
Our final clue here, and this to me is just the pièce de résistance of the novel, and it's a two-part clue, both of which require close reading. You know how fond I am of clues that require close reading, such as in Five Little Pigs. So it only happens, I believe, 3 times in the novel. But we mentioned that Dora Bunner, in her sort of airheaded way, sometimes misspeaks and calls Letty Lottie. It's 1 letter difference, but it is in there at least 3 times. And Letitia Blacklock seems to get annoyed with Dora every time it happens. And then the second part to this clue, which is so devious and so small, but so crucial.
We get to read an old letter along with Miss Marple written from Letitia Blacklock to her sister Charlotte. And in the letter, she talks about how her boss, RG, has, quote, been making enquiries, end quote. And enquiries is written with an E. Miss Marple even notes this phrase after she reads the letter. And then 2 pages later, we're shown another written document from Letitia Blacklock, although this one is a much more recent note she scribbled to Mrs. Harmon, the vicar's wife, in which she uses the word inquiries again, but this time she spelled it with an I.
That's curious because there really is a correct spelling. I believe that it is with the I, but it's odd for someone to spell the same word that they're using in exactly the same way, 2 different ways. So maybe something's going on here with Letty and Lottie, i.e. Letitia and Charlotte Blacklock.
A supernaturally astute reader just may deduce from this that the woman who wrote enquiries with an E in that years-old letter may not be the same person who scribbled inquiries with an I more recently. But, I mean, come on. This is such a hard clue, and I love it so. And what's so extra brilliant about this is when Miss Marple highlights that phrase, making inquiries, we think it's the inquiries themselves she's thinking about, maybe something RG knew or what have you, but it's a total misdirect because Miss Marple is thinking about nothing other than the spelling of the word. It reminds me of that stooping to look at a calendar clue in Hercule Poirot's Christmas, the deduction of which was that the man stooping was nearsighted. It's just brilliant misdirection. I think it's finally time for our resolution, so here goes. Miss Blacklock is Miss Blacklock, but she's the wrong Miss Blacklock. The woman we've known for all these pages as Letitia is, in fact, Charlotte. Here's what happened. Charlotte was a recluse because she had a goiter, which is an unseemly enlarged thyroid her jerk of a father wouldn't let her remove via an operation. So once he died, the real Letty quit her job with Randall Girdler and went to Switzerland to help her sister through the operation, which was a success. Unfortunately, Letty died in Switzerland from pneumonia just as Lottie was beginning to enjoy her life, which included looking forward to the money her sister was about to inherit once that pesky Belle Girdler finally croaked. So Charlotte took matters into her own hands, pretending it was Charlotte who had died, and then moving to a new town where no one knew her, and where she could impersonate her sister for however long it takes till Belle dies. That tacky string of pearls is, of course, hiding the scar from her goiter removal surgery. And the only further complication, which she 100% brings on herself, is to invite Dora into her home, because when Dora writes to Letty, asking for a place to stay, it's of course Lottie who answers. Dora was their childhood friend and she knew both sisters. And even though it's a risk, Charlotte trusts Dora to keep her secret for her. Unfortunately, she's just not quite up to the task when things get hot and heavy, owing to the fact that Rudy Shares
recognizes her as Charlotte Blacklock, not Letitia, because he had once been a porter at the clinic where Charlotte was staying in Switzerland. So that means he has to be killed. After that happens, and then there's all this investigation and flurry of activity going on about little Paddocks, poor Dora keeps on making those mistakes, saying Lottie instead of Letty. She's babbling on to Miss Marple about lamps that have been switched out of the drawing room. And the reason why that was such a disaster is that is the way that Charlotte Blacklock shorted the fuse of the lamp by spilling water from a vase onto the frayed cord of the lamp,
which cut off all the electricity in the room, and which of course is exactly what happened in the vicarage with Miss Marple and Tiglath-Pileser. That's why Miss Marple was so interested in that sequence of events. So once the lights were off, Lottie, in her own house, was able to go through the second door that she had oiled and sneak up behind Rudy Shares, who wasn't even holding a gun. And she fired the gun twice in the direction of where she had been standing. Amy Murgatroyd at this point saw that Charlotte Blacklock wasn't there, which is what she meant when she said she wasn't there. So those are the 2 gunshots. And then the third gunshot was directly into Rudy Shares, killing him. And then she ran back to her previous place in the drawing room through that door, shutting it behind her and nipping her ear, thereby bleeding profusely and inducing everyone to assume that one of the bullets had grazed her ear. It's pretty ingenious. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of this novel is the real affection that exists between Charlotte and Dora as old childhood friends, because Charlotte did this out of the goodness of her heart, her murderous heart, bringing her into the fold at Little Paddocks because Dora wrote to her because she was destitute.
And, the other sad thing is it's not necessarily with malice that Charlotte becomes Letitia. She does it because she wants a do-over. basically. It's selfish, but it's not necessarily malicious. It's a major point that Miss Marple makes.
This is what she says. She was actually a kindly, affectionate creature. That's an odd description of a murderess, said Edmund. I don't know that it is, said Miss Marple. Weak and kindly people are often very treacherous, and if they've got a grudge against life, it saps the little moral strength that they may possess. That's such a Miss Marple analysis of character, and she's totally right.
Yeah, right. And so, I mean, we should get to, I suppose, there's like some hijinks at
some
the
loose
end.
ends to tie up. Mm-hmm.
The entire denouement unfolds.
Mitzi bursts into the drawing room, as she does, Miss Physical Comedy. She's often bursting into rooms or banging into people.
It's like basically like Lucy Ricardo.
Right, Lucy Ricardo as a refugee of the Holocaust. So Mitzi says that she actually saw Miss Blacklock shooting Rudy Scher. She looked through the keyhole, and then she just leaves and storms off back to the kitchen.
And then in the meantime, Craddock, accuses Edmund of being the killer for Pip's money, because guess what, Kemper? Pip and Emma are in this story.
Oh, yes, they are.
Julia is actually Emma. She's made this arrangement with Patrick that he would just pretend it was his sister while his sister was trying out an acting career in Australia, which when you start explaining it like this, it just sounds very convoluted, but it actually plays out much more smoothly than that. And Philippa is Pip.
Yeah, it actually plays out really smoothly because it's kind of funny. Throughout, Patrick and Julia especially have been a bit of comic relief. They have a lot of wry, quippy asides that they make. But when the mask is finally lifted, I love that. The reason why is Patrick's real sister actually writes to Miss Blacklock. And Julia's like, yeah, Patrick just basically forgot to wire his real sister to tell her to stay away because she's given up on the acting thing. And she's like, I'm coming to Little Paddocks. And Patrick was just like, oopsie, yeah, I forgot that. And then when Julia just finally admits to being Emma and that she came here not with any nefarious purpose, but just basically to insinuate herself into Miss Blacklock's affection so that maybe, when she became very wealthy, she would remember her with a little bit of money or support her somehow. She's been pretending to work at a hospital this whole time.
And she just goes to the movies?
She goes to the movies, and this is what she says. Hours and hours I've spent in the pictures seeing the most frightful films over and over again.
It's very, very funny. Philippa has her own subplot in that her husband, there's a story that he was a deserter in Italy.
Yeah, he was a deserter in the war, and she was sort of ashamed of him, and she doesn't want her young son to be ashamed. But then he dies trying to save a child. So it's all good because he died a hero's death. Yes, I mean, this is one of those instances in which summarizing the book is not totally fair because...
No, because it seems like everything in the kitchen sink when you describe it like that.
And we will call out, as all of our listeners know, we have no problem calling out Christie when she overstuffs her books and it doesn't work and it feels just like a stewy mess of half-cooked side plots. I was actually struck, especially having just covered Crooked House, which we called out for how lean it is and how almost empty of plot the book is, in a good way.
Yeah,
this is like the opposite in a good way. This is stuffed in a good way where, I mean, I think you can see the scope that Christie had attained at this point as a writer. When you look at Crooked House and A Murder is Announced being written side by side, this book is stuffed with side plot and incident and side characters and tiny little things going on and just all swirling around. But it does all come together and make sense. And it's very satisfying when we reach our conclusion. You can see her managing to pull everything together. Like she just manages to get it all under control at the end for a satisfying conclusion. And it's impressive.
Yeah, so just to finish up.
Because we're not done.
We're not done.
Craddock puts on this act accusing Edmund of being the killer because he wanted Pip's money because he knew that Philippa was Pip and he's had all these romantic designs on Philippa. We find out at this moment that Philippa is Pip, which, by the way, is also a little surprising because the assumption had always been that Pip and Emma were a male-female twin pair. It was all very Twelfth Night, but in fact, fraternal twins can also both be girls, so it was Julia and Philippa. While all this is going on, this Blacklock moseys on over to the kitchen and tries to murder Mitzi at the sink. But she ceases these murderous activities when she hears what she thinks is Dora's voice. apparently from beyond the grave, telling her not to do it. And she essentially has a nervous breakdown. And what's happening here, Catherine? Are we in ghost territory? Is this the mystery of the blue train again?
I am happy to tell you that it turns out that Dark Marple's bag of skills apparently includes uncanny impersonations. Because she's been hiding in a closet, Kemper, in order to catch Letitia/Charlotte in the act of murder and confession.
She literally says, I could always mimic people's voices. And then later she says, I was in the broom cupboard in the kitchen. Luckily, I'm very thin. We know that this is what Miss Marple does, right? She sets traps. She does not monologue in a grand denouement a la
Oh, no,
Poirot.
no. She is a set trapper. Well, I should note that there's a many-page final chapter at the vicarage, and Miss Marple just gets to explain everything to, like, her good friends. So there is a little bit the grand drawing room thing.
It's a gentlewomanly version. It's not everyone. It's around the fireside. But yes, it's like she's schooling them on what she did and how she did it. John Curran had a really good point, which is that often in the Marple stories, it's necessary for Miss Marple to spring a trap because she doesn't have any solid proof as to who done it. And, you know, I would add that it's just not in her nature to do the dramatic reckoning a la Poirot because she's too much of a Victorian gentlewoman for such theatrics. But in this case, there's actually a lot of proof. There's a lot of evidence. We have the 2 china lamps, one of them fused out and broken. We have the letters with the variant spellings. We have ear witnesses for Dora misspeaking. We have the scar on Charlotte Blacklock's neck, presumably hospital records in Switzerland. They could also snap a photo of her and messenger it on up to Scotland before Belle expires.
It's actually one of the weirder things in it because there is a lot of focus on missing photographs in this. Belle doesn't have any photographs because their London townhouse was bombed in the Blitz.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
So there's a lot of noting of the lack of photographs, and it's a little bit like, well, gosh, you could just take one probably.
Yeah, no, this is an eminently provable murder plot, but it's in keeping with Marple, and the trap was sprung, and it was eventually successful, and we have reached the end of A Murder is Announced. Don't worry, don't touch that dial. We still have lots of chatter about adaptations and rankings to come. We just want you to pause for a moment, not for a traditional advertisement, because we don't do those on this podcast, nor do we ask for any sort of monetary contribution on these regular podcast episodes. There is always our Patreon, of course, if you're itching to contribute that way. But we did want to ask a favor of you. That is to give us a rating and review wherever you're listening to the podcast right now, be it Apple Podcasts or Stitcher or anywhere else. It truly helps us out because the way that the podcast is promoted and presented on these various platforms is directly linked to how many ratings and reviews we have. Your one rating and review truly helps us reach more people in the crowded field of podcasts, and it would just be a way of showing your appreciation for the episodes that you've listened to thus far. So please go right ahead and pause right here to leave that rating and review. And we thank you so much for doing that. We are now going to continue and get into the 2 adaptations that we have for this lovely novel. As is so often the case with Miss Marple novels, we have a Joan Hickson adaptation, and then we have another adaptation from the aughts in the Agatha Christie's Marple series. And I should mention just very briefly in passing that there are 2 theatrical adaptations of the novel, one in 1956 and one in 1977, but neither was written by Christie, so let's not waste much time on them, other than to note that the 1956 adaptation featured Roger Moore as that sexy devil, Patrick Simmons.
And Jessica Tandy.
And Jessica Tandy as Letitia Blacklock. And I find that amusing because, I mean, Letitia Blacklock doesn't necessarily have to be a super old lady. She is fairly aged in both of the adaptations we're going to discuss in a moment, but Jessica Tandy was only 47 when she did it. That was a full 33 years away from her Miss Daisy days. So the Joan Hickson adaptation, this was the third adaptation in the first season/series. So it aired in 1985. And along with The Body in the Library, this is the only novel that takes up 3 60-minute episodes. So all the other adaptations within this Joan Hickson series are 1 or 2 episodes long. The last 4 adaptations are just one single 60-minute episode per novel. You know, we talked about this a little bit in The Body in the Library, but this is the first season. This is back when they were still proving themselves to Rosalind Hicks in terms of how faithful they were going to be to Christie's text. And I'll be honest, I found that the adaptation suffers for that faithfulness because it feels a little slavish to me. The pacing is slow, and as can sometimes happen with these Hickson adaptations, there are a lot of scenes that feel a little airless. There's not that much scoring, especially to a 21st century ear. I think we're just used to much heavier, busier scores. So some of the issues I had with The Body in the Library 3-episode adaptation, I definitely had with this one, if not more so. And I think part of that too is that there are just so many side plots and so much incident and so many side characters stuffed into this book, and it works for the novel. She does tie them all up, but it's a little laborious seeing every single one of those tied up within this adaptation.
I also think that I had a more positive reaction to The Body in the Library adaptation than you did, if I remember, which is like, which is like kind of odd. I don't know that I would have anticipated that. I do think you're right that it's a little bit on the long side. We mentioned that this book is, for Christie, a little bit on the long side, but it doesn't read like that at all.
I actually did just want to point out 2 interesting things about the Hickson adaptation. One is that Kevin Whately is in it. Our dear Sergeant Lewis plays a very Sergeant Lewis role as Detective Sergeant Fletcher, and he's the second in command to D.I. Craddock. One of the more delightful exchanges that Miss Marple has with anyone in this adaptation is with Kevin Whately here.
Oh, may I go into the house, Sergeant?
Of course. You're beyond suspicion, Miss Marple.
Oh, nobody is beyond suspicion.
God, I miss Lewis so much.
Yeah, me too. And then the other really fun fact about this adaptation, and this is actually something that our friend Mark Aldridge recently tweeted about on October 29th, Murder is Announced Day. There's this fantastic letter, and it has to do with the dog that was cast in the role of Miss Hinchcliffe and Miss Murgatroyd's dog. And it was this red setter who apparently would just refused to sniff out Miss Murgatroyd's body, no matter how many times they directed it to do so. So the poor actor who played Miss Murgatroyd had to, quote, lie on the damp ground covered in chicken liver paste in an attempt to coax it in her direction. You know, the glamorous life of an actor. I should be clear that I don't dislike the Hickson adaptation. I think I was just surprised by the pacing issues that I felt it had, especially in comparison to the series that I'm used to liking a lot less, which is, of course, Agatha Christie's Marple. So moving to that one, this was the 4th episode also of the first season/series. It's in the exact same spot. And that aired in 2005. So this is Geraldine McEwen as Miss Marple, the first actress playing Miss Marple here. It's half the runtime. It's 90 minutes. There are a lot of characters who are cut out. There's no Mrs. Easterbrook. There's no Philippa Hames, Edmund Swetnam romance side plot. It's an all-star cast. So first of all, speaking of sexy devil Patrick Simmons, here it's played by Matthew Goode. And then Lottie Blacklock is played by none other than Zoe Wanamaker, Ariadne Oliver herself in the Suchet Poirot series.
Right.
The one change that I didn't like is that the denouement is very much a Poirotian one. Geraldine McEwen monologues her explanation of whodunit. There's not that admittedly clunky trap laid for Miss Blacklock like there is in the book. The Hickson version, they excised Miss Marple throwing her voice, but she still did lay a trap. So they were just a bit more faithful, I think, to the Trappist Miss Marple. And I like that a lot more. And then, of course, this doesn't come as a surprise, but given that A Murder is Announced does feature one of Christie's more prominent homosexual couples, and we know that the Agatha Christie's Marple series was in general obsessed with homosexuality, almost in kind of a puerile way, it's not a surprise that the Mrs. Hinchcliffe and Murgatroyd here are a lot younger and more conventionally attractive, and there's a bit more made of their lesbian affair. It's a lot more out there than it is in the book or in the Hickson adaptation, which is very in keeping with the book. But quite honestly, it could have been a lot worse, given how silly I think this series can get when it comes to same-sex relationships. I was actually pleasantly surprised on that score as well. So I had no major problems with the Agatha Christie's Marple adaptation here.
I still have the problem that of Agatha Christie's Marple, I can do Julia Mackenzie. I just have a bigger problem with Geraldine McEwen.
I agree with you. I prefer Julia Mackenzie, but I thought that Geraldine McEwen's performance here was fine. I actually think that Geraldine McEwen's performance gets campier and zanier in a bad way in the subsequent seasons. I think that in the first season, she was a little bit more grounded as Miss Marple. Maybe the writing and the direction was just a little more grounded too. Yeah. I think it gets a little too crazy for my taste, but only later on.
That's fair. I don't know that I would go and write home about either of these.
No,
you know?
I wouldn't either. And I actually think that, we often sometimes when we come across a novel that doesn't have an outstanding adaptation, we bemoan the fact that, this novel deserves its transcendent filmic version. I think A Murder is Announced is really hard to adapt for the screen. I think it works really well as a book.
Because there is so much content, it sometimes feels like when you read a really dense book that has a lot of world building in it, and how that's really compelling in a book form, and then maybe isn't so much. To use as an example, I actually don't mind spending, I didn't as a kid, did not mind spending, 40 pages learning about a Quidditch match for Harry Potter. But anytime that you have to spend 15 minutes of screen time trying to explain the rules of Quidditch, it's not compelling.
No, agreed. This isn't like The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, which is nigh impossible to adapt for the screen, but it doesn't lend itself to the screen in the way that I think many Christie titles do.
Speaking of just completely idle speculation, Kemper, you know that Hugh Laurie is doing an unnamed Christie adaptation, and I saw 2 people online make the suggestion that wouldn't it be interesting for Hugh Laurie to do Murder of Roger Ackroyd? Dr. House, I'd be curious.
Yeah, no, absolutely. All right, well, let's move into our rankings, starting with plot mechanics as we always do. And I am going to start, as I often do, with John Curran's hot take, because I always think it's worth listening to, and I happen to totally agree with him. Here's what he says. A Murder is Announced remains one of the best detective novels Christie ever wrote. It qualifies effortlessly for the top 10, and it is easily the best of the Marple titles, the last of the ingeniously constructed, daringly clued, and perfectly paced detective novels, and a wonderful half-century title. I was trying to figure out the best way to break down what I think this novel does so well, and I think it's about the fact that Christie is marrying 3 tricks that we've seen her pull off before and marrying them together so well. So we already talked about the 2 older ladies performing a switcheroo and all of the various short stories and even novels where we saw that happening.
Right.
She's clearly doing that here. She then is also using the, by this point, age-old Christie trope of the unmasking of shadowy characters who were referred to by some mysterious alias. This novel had some shades of NRM for me, just in the fun of Pip and Emma and the way that everyone was kind of on top of each other in this house in Little Paddocks. It wasn't the same as a boarding house in wartime, but it had a little bit of that rompish feel to who are Pip and Emma and what is happening here. And then especially given the misdirection that red herring investigation holds.
And also missing aspirin, Kemper.
Yeah, and missing aspirin. This is true. We didn't have Tommy and Tuppence, but you can't have everything. So there's that. And then the third and final trick, of course, is the trope of the would-be victim did it. Right? The whole time we think that Letitia Blacklock is the victim, and it turns out that she, even though she happens to be named Charlotte Blacklock, is the murderer. And we obviously saw Christie pull this off brilliantly in podcast favorite Peril at End House.
Right.
It was also used in 1-2 Buckle My Shoe. It's going to be used in a future Miss Marple novel. I will not spoil which one that is. I would argue that it works well here for similar reasons as to why it works so well in Peril at End House, which is that in both cases, the would-be victim killer/murderer is such a likable character. Like, both Nick and Letty have so much charisma and charm. They're awesome. Like, they're really fun, just quippy, smart, sharp-tongued, interesting characters throughout. And when it turns out that they're the murderers, it's shocking and even kind of sad and upsetting, where you're like, oh, wait a second, I kind of loved them. Oh, they're the murderer? That's powerful. Like, this novel has a similar trajectory when it comes to that trope as Parallel End House, and that's like a major compliment. You know?
No, it isn't. Well, I mean, obviously, my feelings about Parallel End House are that it's great. So, yeah, I feel similarly. I mean, I've already mentioned this, but I would say that the single neatest trick that this book pulls off is the red herring. I think it's so incredibly cleverly done. I sometimes get like a little irked by too many red herrings. Like, I don't like them. This is just executionally so smart.
It's, dare I say, the perfect red herring. I mean, my favorite clue still is the Lottie, Letty, and inquiry business. Because, again, I love the close reading. I just think it's so devious because it's barely there. And John Curran actually has a great anecdote about this. He writes, in an undated note to Collins, Christie draws attention to the galley proofs and the correct spellings of Lottie and enquiries, reminding them of the importance of ensuring that they are printed incorrectly sometimes. And she writes, plot depends on this. So I love the idea of her having to make sure that her editors aren't correcting the mistakes within the text, because that actually is the clue. The way that she puts inquiries and enquiries in two different letters side by side, it's like if they had been in two different letters that weren't side by side, it would have been just too arcane, obscure, arcane of a clue. But like putting them side by side like that, once you're on the other side of the clue, you're like, oh, okay, that's fair, and really clever and really devious. It's like she's calibrating the clue with the precision of a physicist. I really, really appreciated that. Apparently, this is a tidbit I picked up from Janet Morgan, Christie biographer. Christie actually acted out the drawing room sequence with friends while planning this book. And she sent everyone out of the drawing room and rearranged the furniture and then instructed them to come in with a flashlight. And then apparently she asked them all what they had seen. And it was only after the book was published that her friends realized the true test was what they hadn't seen. As we so often do, we should probably talk about plot mechanics and plot credibility at the same time before we rank either of them, because I think that this book falls into the classic pattern that we've seen so many times before of, I think, having outstanding plot mechanics, but a little bit at the expense of plot credibility.
Hugely at the expense.
I don't think we've had a more stark case where the mechanics are so good and the credibility is so poor compared to the mechanics, which is really interesting.
It's one of those things where it's hard because, again, it's fun because sometimes I get annoyed by the plot credibility when it's ludicrous and then also not fun, which does occasionally happen.
Yep.
This is just, I'm sorry, the Pip and Emma stuff is beyond ludicrous.
Oh, I actually disagree. I mean, I don't think that it's the Pip and Emma stuff. I think here's the main issue, and it kind of mirrors our discussion that we had with Death on the Nile, right? Where we were saying, is this really the best way to murder your wife for money if you need to? And like, we've since, I think, come around from that initial conversation we had with Death on the Nile. Like, there's at least a valid argument to make that if you want to kill your wife with your ex-lover, you should at least do so on a crowded ship with enough people around you to construct a seemingly cast iron alibi, rather than killing your wife at your house on a random Tuesday when no one's around, you know?
It's true, but like, yeah, you're right. So if I think I know where you're going with this, it's that if you wanted to kill Rudy's shirts, you would just have him meet you at some random place and hit him with your car.
Or you'd hire a hitman. Yeah. Here's the thing. Charlotte Blacklock is recognized by this random guy from Switzerland, and he works at a hotel. She now needs...
And he's a criminal.
He's a petty criminal. She needs, in these crucial weeks before Belle Girdler dies and she inherits this fortune, she needs in these crucial weeks simply to make him disappear and to have it not stick to her whatsoever. So she invites him into her house has him shot in front of all of these people for seemingly no reason. No one believes that he did it accidentally or committed suicide, which is why the police then subsequently have to go on to investigate, because they're like, this makes no sense. Why would this have happened? And then that leads them exactly to what was actually going on, i.e. she was impersonating her sister. She basically did the worst thing she could have possibly done to achieve her aims.
Right. And also, here's the other thing. There's not actually, unless I misread, there's not a huge implication that she was under any real risk from him.
No, I think, though, that her motivation for murdering him does not strain credibility. It's the way she went about murdering him. But there's the thing. It's super fun, right? I mean, this is perhaps one of Christie's best hooks. A murder is freaking announced. Like, what? But in the best Christie novels, and I mean the very, very, very best, right? Five Little Pigs, and Then There Were None. Crooked House, exactly. Plot credibility is not strained in this way.
No.
Even though there's a gonzo, super fun mechanics, we believe that whoever did the murder went about in the way that they would have because of who they were and what they wanted to achieve. We don't have that here. Where I come down on this is that I think plot mechanics is incredibly high, and I think that plot credibility is pretty low.
Yeah. I mean, I would almost be willing to go even higher than I probably would have on plot mechanics to try to balance it out a little bit. I mean, I probably would go to a 9 on mechanics because I would want to go to somewhere in this 5-6 range for credibility.
Oh my God, Catherine, I'm a 9 on mechanics and a 5 on credibility.
Oh my God, Kemper. I want all of our listeners to know, sometimes we discuss this in advance. We have not discussed this in advance.
Nope. All right. I'm really glad. I think that makes a lot of sense because we haven't gone as low as a 5 in a while. And it feels weird to go that low for this book because it's such a fantastic book. But this is the category where it deserves some low marks. But I'm really happy with the 9 on plot mechanics because we haven't given a 9 since Five Little Pigs. Let's move on to series long characters. I'm gunning here, Catherine, because we already talked about Sir Henry Clithering, who technically is a series long character. Best line in the novel, first of all.
Clearly.
Even though Miss Marple doesn't make her first appearance until a third of the way through the book, which is a little late. Once she appears, she really doesn't disappear until she actually does technically disappear at the end of the book, but not for many pages. She doesn't disappear as we saw her do in The Moving Finger. She's not swallowed up by 18 other detectives as she was in The Body in the Library. And we get lots of Marple here and just lots of really good instances of Marpelian activities and thoughts. And I ate up all of them.
We also get so many St. Mary Mead stories.
Yeah, well, first of all, we get a fresh physical description, which I appreciated because I'm always fascinated to see just how old she happens to be at any point in time.
Extra old in this one, apparently.
Extra old, which I thought was very interesting. I thought she had been getting younger, but apparently not. This is what Christie writes. She seemed indeed very old. She had snow white hair and a pink crinkled face and very soft, innocent blue eyes, and she was heavily enmeshed in fleecy wool. Wool round her shoulders in the form of a lacy cape, and wool that she was knitting and which turned out to be a baby's shawl. That's an old lady.
Yeah, except later on, those blue eyes get real hard. There is a sharpness there.
Well, is she wearing a lot of wool when she's stuffing herself into the broom cupboard and throwing her voice? Maybe. I don't know. Here were a few other Marple moments I appreciated. Her candid blue eyes swept over the manly proportions and handsome face of Detective Inspector Craddock with truly feminine Victorian appreciation.
Well, here's another thing that I actually very much appreciate about this book. There's a lot of opinions of other people about Miss Marple and her Victorian attitudes, and they're all obviously undermined.
Yep. Miss Marple has an incredible amount of agency in this novel because she's given access immediately, as I mentioned, by Sir Henry Clithering. She's shoulder to shoulder. She's even leading the charge when she disappears and sets up this trap, right?
Right. Yep.
She's acting independently of Craddock at that point. I loved that. And I'm not totally sure because we haven't gotten there yet to a lot of the other Marple novels, but I think that this is one of the most active Marple novels that we have. And I think that should be appreciated and celebrated. I did also love how she's convinced that Craddock coming across that second drawing room door was via divine providence. She says, "I think you were led to it, Inspector, but then I'm old-fashioned." Miss Marple is nothing if not a Christian lady. To be fair, actually, to non-Dark Marple in the text, there are a lot of heartfelt moments, I think, that Miss Marple has with various characters. And one is with our murderer. after Dora dies, and she's talking about how she's the only one now left in the world because Dora was the last one who remembers. And this is what Miss Marple says there. I know what you mean. One is alone when the last one who remembers is gone. I have nephews and nieces and kind friends, but there's no one who knew me as a young girl. No one who belongs to the old days. I've been alone for quite a long time now.
Hey, can I give you a podcast gift, Kemper?
Yes, please.
Do you want to know where I come down on this category?
Where do you come down?
Oh, I'd give it a 10.
Catherine, I feel like you're giving me this 10 because you basically just want me to shut up about Miss Marple, and that's totally fine. I'm going to take your 10 and run with it. All right, so book-specific characters. I don't think this category is super low. It's not necessarily super high either.
I think that there are too many characters, arguably, which sometimes you can have a ton of characters and they can all be really specific, and sometimes you can have these people, and Letitia/Charlotte is an interesting character. I think the two spinsters are...
Are they really spinsters, Catherine?
No.
Or are they in spirit married to each other?
I think they're probably in a loving relationship because, especially towards the end of the book, it doesn't even seem like it's implied.
In all seriousness, actually, the Mrs. Hinchcliffe and Murgatroyd are her best depiction of a same-sex couple. We had all of those slightly icky depictions of male homosexuality in Lord Edgeworth Dies and Murder is Easy and The Moving Finger, but there's no question. I mean, she keeps on referring to them very particularly as each other's friend. She does not use that same word in the same way with other people.
No.
Miss Hinchcliffe has a, quote, short man-like crop. This was slightly funny, but this is Miss Hinchcliffe remembering Philippa Hames in the drawing room of Little Paddocks on that fateful night. I remember noticing what a nice flat back she has, and I thought to myself, that girl would look well on a horse.
I know, I noticed that line too. It's so odd. But, you know, the other thing is, that's also what we know about Letitia Blacklock. It's why she gets treated as a partner in the finance company, which had to have been incredibly rare. And it's mentioned, you know, she also kept short hair and she had no romantic interest in men. It's a joke. Well, it's not even a joke. It's actually kind of tragic with Belle about how Belle, despite being sick her entire life and despite losing a 2-year-old child, she's actually like really condescending in a weird way, not in a mean way, about Letitia.
Yeah, I don't know if I would say condescending. It's funny. One of the standout characters for me, oddly, is Belle Girdler.
Oh, because she's one of the better characters.
Yeah, well, and it's because the sequence in which Craddock goes up to Scotland to see her sticks out in the book. It has a different texture to it. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of lifted out of the morass of all of those characters in and around Chipping Cleghorn. I think she's just interestingly confident in the life that she's led. I pulled out something she said here, too, because it struck me. She says to Craddock, "But I've had all the things that make life worthwhile. They may have been taken from me, but I have had them. I was pretty and gay as a girl. I married the man I loved, and he never stopped loving me. My child died, but I had him for 2 precious years. I've had lots of physical pain, but if you have pain, you know how to enjoy the exquisite pleasure of the times when pain stops. And everyone's been kind to me always. I'm a lucky woman, really." It's this kind of like spurt of wisdom that's like thrown into the book. And
it's one of the clearest moments in the book, in a weird way. I think it's one of the things that stuck with me, certainly. So
yeah, she kind of springs off of the page, and it's one of the things that Christie does that people don't give her enough credit for. She has these spurts of wisdom sometimes that come out of these characters' mouths, and you're struck by them, and that will often be the odd thing that you remember, right?
Yeah.
Just to cap the conversation on Hinchcliffe and Murgatroyd, because that, for many people, I think, is their takeaway from this book, because it is such a standout depiction of a same-sex couple. I mean, it really is so affecting lamenting when Miss Murgatroyd dies, because Miss Hinchcliffe's reaction is just white hot anger, rage. And grief. She is grief stricken in the way that anyone who loves someone who has been struck down would be grief stricken. And there's this wonderful moment, again, another heartfelt moment with Miss Marple, because Miss Marple and Miss Hinchcliffe are the ones who discover Miss Murgatroyd's body. And Christie writes, they stood there side by side, the rain beating down on them, and the older woman's arm went round the younger one's shoulders. So it's like Miss Marple knows. That's in the text. No. That's not Joan Hickson. That's not the 80s gloss of that's
100% in the book. Yeah.
Yeah, that's Christie. And then later on, too, when she's just dealing with Miss Hinchcliffe's grief, nobody offered Miss Hinchcliffe sympathy or mentioned Miss Murgatroyd's death. The ravaged face of the tall, vigorous woman told its own tale and would have made any expression of sympathy and impertinence. She accords them so much respect and dignity as a couple.
Well, and they're also, by the way, they're smarter than most of the other characters in the book, too.
Yeah. Dora Bunner, too, is extremely well drawn. And then the way that Miss Blacklock has to put her down and gives her the treat of her birthday party in the same way you'd give a dog a treat before putting it down. It feels real. It's ugly. It actually manages to be both pathetic and horrifying at the same time, similar to Josephine Leonides, actually, in Crooked House, so. Right? So, I certainly don't think the book-specific characters deserve anything in the 8, 9, 10 category by any means. I come out on a 6 or a 7 for book-specific characters.
I'm probably going towards a 6 because I think that the big failure here is the younger characters, which, is an odd thing because I don't actually normally say that with Christie. Mm-hmm. She usually has quite a good deal of sympathy and a surprisingly keen ear for and interest in them. And here, I don't think they work.
I agree. They feel slight and superficial. I can more than live with a 6. I think I edge even more toward a 6 than a 7 myself. So yeah, I fully agree with that.
That's great.
All right. So setting in tone, I think this is quite high. It's funny. This will be, I believe, our 4th book that gets an 8 in setting and tone if we give it an 8, which is what I think that we should give it.
No, it's exactly where I land.
Oh, Catherine, where have you been all my life? Doing this podcast, actually.
Apparently, yes. What we spend all of our time on, Kemper.
Yep,
so.
That's where you've been. I mentioned Little Paddocks itself. The house where the action takes place just feels very well drawn. It feels like that drawing room is a real room. The blocking and the specifics of it, even though it can get a little annoying, I did appreciate the specificity. Chipping Cleghorn might be the best name for a town in any Christie novel. I adore the name. And I think that the town itself is very well drawn. I think it's much better than Limstock in The Moving Finger. It's better than Witchwood Under Ash and Murder is Easy. Market Basing and Dumb Witness. Those are all towns that are fine, but I think that she really captures something, with Chipping Cleghorn.
I would go back also to the descriptions of the incidents in St. Mary Mead because it feels like you get so much from just a few little anecdotes.
You get such a sense of community, which is funny because one of the other big takeaways that I think a lot of people have for this book is the way that it captures the post-war setting. This will be the 3rd book in which we talk about Christie capturing the post-war setting. She did it in Taken at the Flood. Then when we got to Crooked House, I was like, you know what? I think she's actually evoking it better there. And now I might make the argument that she's evoking it even better in A Murder is Announced. But as I so often do, I'm going to quote John Curran on this. He writes, apart from its sublime detective plot, A Murder is Announced is also a convincing picture of an England stumbling out of post-war austerity. We are no longer in the world of butlers and cocktail receptions. There is no dressing for dinner or questioning the lady's maid, no weekend guest or alibi provided by nights at the opera. The shadow of rationing and bartering, deserters and foreign help, ration books and identity cards hovers over the book.
Yeah.
And he's so right.
No, because we haven't really talked about it, but there is a lot of page real estate given to the barter system, some of it under the guise of flirtation and jokes. right?
Mm-hmm.
Bartering honey or bartering skim
Butter,
milk.
I think also.
Yeah, and a huge amount of butter gets bartered.
I have this throwaway reference to Cole. You know the fuel office won't even let us have the little bit that's due to us each week. Not unless we can say definitely that we haven't got any other means of cooking. There's just constant little references to austerity. And there's definitely at least one reference to taxes. There's also a real standout section in which Miss Marple talks about how village life has changed irrevocably since the Second World War. And I actually like to rely on Joan Hickson to do the talking for me.
You know, the English village has changed since before the war. That's really because the whole world has changed. A village like Chipping Cleghorn, for example, it may look the same, simple and peaceful and eternal, but it isn't. You see, in the old days, everyone knew each other. And if someone new came to the village, then they brought letters of introduction. They'd either been in the same regiment or the same ship or the same colony as someone already living in the village, you see.
And that no longer applies?
Oh, gone forever, I suspect. Well, the big houses are sold, the cottages converted, and people simply come in from anywhere. No letters of introduction, no roots. You'll have to believe their stories and take them at their face value.
And what's so brilliant about this is that is a key element in the puzzle mystery, right? The reason why Miss Blacklock can return from Switzerland to this town and put herself out there as being her sister is that no one really knows her. And if it had been before the war and you had to actually get letters of introduction and live among people that you know, it would have been harder to pull off.
Well,
So
it's also not only that, but a number of the people in the book have lost investments that were in Europe. So not in England, but investments that they had that were in Europe. So that's partially how all of their income has been impacted. They've lost the money that they had as security. We've seen this before about the reduction in pension rates. These were people who had, in fact, been like very small c conservative about their financial planning, only for it when they need it to actually work out in their retirement or in the event of a catastrophe, they no longer have anything. And so it's about essentially living on a margin, right? It's about like having this knife's edge.
It makes people dangerous. It makes life more dangerous than it would have been before when things felt more secure. And it's a great setting for a murder mystery. I mean, I think it's why we're now on our third novel that is really harping on that post-war setting, because I think she mined it for all it was worth. For these stories and to fantastic effect. So yes, we're giving an 8, right, to setting and tone.
We are.
And now we are in it stuck in its time, and there are a few potentially xenophobic statements peppered here and there, usually in reference to Mitzi, but those are all in the mouths of other characters. It's really Mitzi's portrayal within the book, the portrayal of her as a character within this book, which is not done solely through the mouths of other characters, but just also through the narrative storytelling, which we cannot help ascribing to Christie, which I think rankled me and is the reason why we cannot, unfortunately, dismiss this category. I mean, I think that the most telling thing is that she is markedly less ridiculous in both adaptations. You could not portray Mitzi the way she's portrayed in the novel in a televised adaptation either in 1985 or 2005. It's not going to fly.
It's a real knock on the book. Julia Simmons, who's actually Emma, turned out to have been in the French Resistance. And it's Julia also, though, who is one of the meaner people towards Mitzi. And there's a weird disconnect between somebody who would have been a member of the resistance fighting for liberation in France, who is also so kind of xenophobic. It doesn't track.
There's this odd kind of patronizing, dismissive tone to her portrayal overall. I mean, first of all, we're not even sure where she's from. It's never specified. She's just like vaguely middle central European. She's a pastiche from the beginning. She's a pastiche of cliches. And yet she's given this specific backstory, which she refers to again and again, but always in the context of humorous asides about having seen her whole family die in the Holocaust. I pulled out some of these quotes. She says, "I do not wish to die." This is in the aftermath of the murder of Rudy Shares. "I do not wish to die. Already in Europe I escape. My family, they all die. They are all killed. My mother, my little brother, my so sweet little niece, all they are killed. But me, I run away. I hide. I get to England. My enemies, the Nazis, or perhaps this time it is the Bolsheviks." And the way that it's put in there, you know that this is being played for laughs. There's a throwaway reference to Patrick Simmons as a joke sending Mitzi a postcard saying the Gestapo is on her track. I think we're just supposed to think that it's like, oh, ha, 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 silly.
They lock her into the kitchen during the murder while she screams. Yeah, there's something just disconcertingly off about it. It's the fly in the Chardonnay, Kemper.
No, I agree. It's the fly in the Chardonnay. I mean, here's where I come down in terms of how many points we need to deduct. I think it has to be more than one.
Yep.
However, in The Hollow, we deducted 3. I think that The Hollow, for its forthright anti-Semitism, which is just as peppered throughout and just as unavoidable in the book, there was an element to how forthright and overtly comedic it was there that I found even more distasteful, which is why I ultimately come down on 2 for this.
I think that's more insidious because it's not just a caricature of a dress shop owner, which is overtly gross. I'm not going to necessarily argue for more deductions. I do think that maybe the next time we do rankings next year, that this is a legitimate conversation to have.
I'm totally open to reevaluating because I hear you.
I would also note that there are 3 foreigners in this book, really. There's Sonia's husband, the Greek gentleman, who apparently scammed his daughter off into schools across Europe. And there's Rudy Shares, who's our first murder victim, who is of unknown ethnic origin and a criminal. And there's Mitzi, who knows what her deal is. And I don't think the depiction of the foreigners in this is, I mean, I think it's by and large not a good thing.
I agree with that. All right, so we are now at the point of our grand summing up for Murder is Announced.
Intriguing.
Yep, we have 9 plus 5 plus 10 plus 6 plus 8 minus 2 deductions for a grand total of 36 points, putting A Murder is Announced in 5th place.
Yeah, that seems accurate.
That seems accurate to me, too. So right now, here's our current top 10. 5 Little Pigs, And Then There Were None, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, Crooked House, A Murder is Announced, Murder on the Orient Express, The Hollow, Death on the Nile, The Murder at the Vicarage, and Peril at End House.
I'm really happy with that top 10 currently.
I am too. We're at 40 of 66. We are definitely heading into the latter portion of Christie titles, and many of the critics and scholars use A Murder is Announced as a bit of a marker between mid-career Christie and later career Christie, and think of this as the last of the superlative titles.
Well, we still have Ordeal by Innocence.
We do, and there are a couple of outliers that punctuate that, and I think Ordeal by Innocence is the most significant one. But you know what? That's why we embarked on this podcast endeavor, because maybe that's not true.
No, and you know what? I'm excited to meet Tommy and Tuppence again in a few years.
Oh, I am too, yeah, by the pricking of my thumbs.
I don't want to be overly excited about that, but I remember loving that book.
And we have a lot of Miss Marples to come that I think are really good, that I think will do well in the rankings. They might not break the top 10.
But also there are books like Dead Man's Folly, as an example, which is one that I have just randomly read a bunch of times. I think I just had an accidental paperback. And, I don't think that we're going to rank them in the top tier, but they are enjoyable reads.
No, totally agree. I'm really interested to see how those latter-day titles compare to the ones that we've ranked already.
Well, and by the way, also, there are some weirdo ones that we still have coming up, too.
Oh, yeah. Well, we still have The Pale Horse.
Yes. Well, that was namely what I was thinking of.
I knew that's what you were thinking of. But you know what novel we have coming up next?
What do we have
after Murder is Announced? We have They Came to Baghdad. Christie thriller. This is one of the ones that's such an outlier that I'm not certain that I've read it. I'm pretty sure I have, but I have zero memory of it, so I'm very excited.
Are you excited? Would that be the actual word?
Perhaps a little trepidatious, but excited nonetheless. Intrigued.
But you know what else we have? And we should alert readers to this. We have coming up an interview with our beloved Sophie Hannah.
Yes.
Which we're very excited about. And then we're also going to have a special episode about Knives Out.
Yes, the Rian Johnson whodunit inspired by Agatha Christie, starring so very many people. Jamie Lee Curtis,
Christopher Plummer,
Daniel Craig,
Chris Evans.
Chris Evans apparently is a delight in this movie.
Wearing a lot of very
rave reviews.
Attractive sweaters.
Yeah, so we figured listeners would be very interested in that movie, so we will be covering that.
And we'll have a tie-in Patreon episode where I believe, Kemper, that we are covering some classic country house murders.
We are some classic country house murder spoofs.
Yes.
We are covering Clue and Murder by Death. So I would imagine those are also favorites of many listeners out there. And then our next episode actually will be a short story episode, and that is Problem at Palensa Bay, a Parker Pine short story. Can never forget our friend.
Our old friend, Parker Pine. Let's see what damage he could do in this one.
Yeah, exactly. All right, well, this was a long episode, but we did not want to shortchange a murder is announced in any way, and we sure haven't. So That is a murder is announced. You can contact us via email at allaboutthedame@gmail.com or on Twitter at allaboutthedame, on Instagram at allaboutagatha, or on our Facebook page, All About Agatha. Catherine is also on Twitter at brobcat. We already asked you to rate and review us, so we won't do that again, although I kind of just did. And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.
Have you made the switch to Knix? Millions of women have made the switch to the revolutionary period underwear from Knix. That's Knix. Period panties from Knix are like no other, making them the #1 leak-proof underwear brand in North America. They're comfy, stylish, and absorbent, perfect for period protection from your lightest to your heaviest days. They look, feel, and machine wash just like regular underwear, but feature incognito protection that has you covered. You can shop sizes from extra small to 4XL. Choose from all kinds of colors, prints, and different styles, from bikinis to boy shorts, thongs to high-rise. You've got to try Knix. See why millions are ditching disposable, wasteful period products and have switched to Knix. Go to knix.com and get 15% off with promo code TRY15. That's Knix.com, promo code TRY15 for 15% off life-changing period underwear. That's knix.com.